Okay, next up on our agenda is we're going to resume the afternoon session. We're going to have Dan Alexander give a presentation on policy simplification.
All right, bear with me through this presentation. I'm going to ask a lot of questions and offer fewer answers, but the hope is that this presentation will spur some new discussions. Allocating resources from the V4 free pool was a primary function of ARIN prior to the depletion of the free pool. It wasn't the only function, but it was one that consumed a considerable amount of time from staff. The question then comes, what does the community feel are the important functions going forward? There's many other topics to talk about. I mean, we could go on this topic for all day, but I tried to focus on three. And that's, is there a different way to look at need? How do we get more IPv6 for small organizations? And with the upcoming fee structure changes, are there useful policy changes as a result of this new fee schedule? The goal of this conversation is simply to drive topics to the mailing list that could result in future policy proposals. I'm not recommending any specific language here. I'm only trying to gain some momentum around concepts that people could support. And I'm also hoping to avoid what has happened in the past where we've sometimes run into the case where we end up with 3 or 4 policy proposals trying to solve the same problem, and we kind of waste time debating, the 9 different ways to solve it. And with that, I'm going to give you an eye chart. Oh, sorry. I'm not keeping up with my notes and your slides. So I don't expect everyone to be able to read this one. It's more intended to download and zoom in on your laptop, but what this shows is across the x-axis there's 36 sections of the policy manual. And over the past 12 months, how many of each section was used to approve all the requests that came into staff? It's divided up by V4 ISP and end user, ASN, IPv6 ISP, V6 end user, and transfers. The numbers don't reflect every way a request could be approved. Sometimes a request could come in that could use several sections as justification for approval, but what staff typically does is whichever of the justifications are the most appropriate approval, that's the one that they use to base the decision on. The one thing that jumped out at me when I started looking at some of this data is, of the 36 sections, 18 of the least used sections account for 2% of the approvals, where the other half of the 36 sections account for 98% of the approvals. If you narrow it down to the top 9 sections, or 25% of these, that alone accounts for 85% of the requests. Section 6531, which is subsequent allocations for transitions, has actually been used 10 times since it was implemented, but 0 times in the last 12 months. And 659, which is V6 for community networks, has never been utilized since it was implemented. So we're spending a lot of time and effort debating need versus no need. There were 4 proposals submitted in 2014, 6 proposals last year, and there's 3 currently on the docket this year that are all addressing this conversation of need versus no need. Is there a middle ground, or are there different ways to evaluate need for IP addresses other than the time-based utilization thresholds. 25%, 50%, 80%, 1 year, 2 years, 30 days. We're spending a lot of time and resources going back and forth to what end? The RIRs were managing the depletion of V4, but that work is, for the most part, completed. We need to answer the question as a community regarding what do we want the registry records to reflect. When you look at within section 4, can the distinctions between ISPs and end users be simplified? These are a number of conditions that are applied to both ISP and end users. The distinction between ISP and end user services is understood, but do all these requirements still need to be applied to the different service levels that are actually offered by the registry? Some might argue that there's a fine line between, trying to be responsible for the resources, or are we deciding who is worthy? Also in section 4, there's a number of sections that may no longer apply now that the free pool has been depleted. The retired sections have also been included in this simply to illustrate that we have done this cleanup work in the past. We have made a lot of changes over time as the policies have evolved. And this isn't just about cleanup, but it's an evolution of what we're considering important under current circumstances. The policies aren't static, and their evolution doesn't have to only go in one direction. When you look at section 6, many of the same questions apply, regarding the complexity of the requirements. Section 6 has 11 subsections, 24 third-level sections, 14 fourth-level sections, and 3 fifth-level sections. We're looking at section 653, 9er B, Roman numeral, We even have some sections that, we're calculating N. Now, to be clear, though, I'm not criticizing any of the previous policy decisions. These choices were made as circumstances evolved. They were a result of what the community was comfortable at the time. But we have to ask ourselves, are we still where we were? It was interesting because ARIN holds the ARIN on the Road events where they do the outreach to cities. They go around to cities where an ARIN meeting of this size can't always be held. So it gives the opportunity for a lot of people that don't normally make it to these meetings, show up and find out more about what we do and have an opportunity to ask a bunch of questions. And I was at the one in Seattle, and I was struck by a question as an engineer got up to the mic, and he's like, who is making all these arbitrary decisions and why? What is the difference if it's 50% or 60% or 10 months or 12 months? Are these, numbers trying to accomplish? And it's really a very valid question. Are the requirements being defined truly serving the intended goals? So also we've got V6 coming on. A lot of people would argue it, but traffic's increasing quickly, and many small organizations still don't have an IPv6 allocation or assignment. The new fee structure that the board put in place was an effort to fix some of the cost concerns, but we have to ask, are there other policy changes that can occur to make it easier for small orgs? Staff presented this slide, and it's interesting because it's definitely trending up and it's a good thing, but it doesn't tell the whole picture, because once you dig down into who actually has the IPv6 allocations, you notice that it's typically centered around the larger organizations. And the smaller organizations are still without IPv6. So with the new fee structure that the board adopted, hopefully that will help, with a number of those issues. But it also raises another interesting point in that, end user organizations now get to choose the registration services plan and can receive the same level of services provided to an ISP. So they can get the additional ability to become a member, vote in elections, and report reassignment information. So I then always ask the question, if a network, the same network have different policy demands placed on it when the only difference is the level of services an organization is willing to pay the registry? Is there an easier way to do that? So the question becomes, how can the safeguards we're applying as stewards of the IP address space better serve the organizations who actually want to use those addresses? And with that, I would welcome any questions or comments.
Microphones are open. Yes, Vin.
So is it your general proposal that a kind of a wholesale rewrite of all the rules be undertaken?
In the extreme case, yes, it would be, because, I think anyone could argue we're in a very different circumstance now as we have been over the last 10 years. And a large portion, as the eye chart shows, a large portion of the policy manual actually isn't even being used. And the interesting thing is, where it is being used, we have a number of all these special circumstances, all these exception cases. Do we really need all those exception cases? Or can we actually generalize the requirements for the resources to the point where one section could account for the 99 or the 100% of the requests?
So just as a thought experiment, I wonder what would happen if we wrote, just drafted for our own amusement, something that we would use solely for an IPv6 only environment, and ask ourselves, what does that look like? I realize that's not reality, but if we did that, it might give us a clue as to what we might try to do with the residual V4 situation, which is more complicated for a lot of different reasons.
We've had similar conversations where, along the lines of that exercise, what if we look at the internet 10, 20, 30 years from now? How should the policies be structured? Yeah. Back, Mike?
Hello, Jose de la Cruz, Internet Society, ARIN Fellow. I just have a question. The definition sections, there is a definition for end user, but there is no definition for ISP. Is every user or ARIN client considered an ISP if they don't meet the definition for end user? That's number one. The second one is a definition for ISP required?
So if you look at the definitions, there is where'd it go? Okay, sorry. There's a local internet registry definition, LIR. Amazingly, that's what we would call an ISP here. And an LIR is an internet registry that primarily assigns address space to the users of the network services it provides.
Okay.
So in this region, if you are an entity that provides network services and you assign address space, you're an LIR, we use the terms LIR and ISP interchangeable.
Okay.
So that's where you'll find the definition.
Okay.
Rear microphone.
Go ahead.
Craig Muller, doing United Utilities. I'd like to recommend, being a first-time user here, being a first-time attendee, what Vint was saying and what you were just saying makes a lot of sense. I'm an engineer by background and currently a manager, and I'm looking at your mission statement, because a lot of these same questions are coming up. What are we trying to do? What is need? What is use? And a lot of them are tailored towards IPv4. And I would challenge you to do exactly what you were talking about, which is to look and make a 5-year plan and a 10-year plan and say, when do we, and you can't put times on them, right? But what has to happen before we retire these sections? When you were having the conversation earlier about the reallocation of IPv4 numbers, I was thinking to myself, we're hitting that tipping point. And I know you just had the graph that said small companies aren't going to V6 yet, but the big ones are, and the big content providers are. And I can see that tipping point, that fall over, where the big guys, the Coxes, the Comcasts and everything, are going to stop supporting V4 because most of the content their customers want are there, and they're going to start returning IPv4 addresses. And there's going to be a glut. And what are you going to do? You're going to need policies for what you're going to do for all these returns, and how your pricing structure is going to change, and all of that. So, is it a lot of work? Yes. You know, and could you spin a lot of cycles by trying to see too far into the future? Possibly. But your questions on what do we do, how do we simplify, I think with all of the bright minds you have in this room and in this organization, you can lay out a pretty good roadmap. You've done an awesome job. I got into the internet in 1983. As a user, as an engineer, as a manager, I've been watching from the outside, and you guys rock. You make all of our lives easier, you know. Thank you for what you do, and, you know, I challenge you to make your 5 and 10 and 15-year plan. So thank you.
Thanks.
One quick note you may not know, we don't do a 10 or 15-year plan, because in the internet, that seems to be looking out at the space so far away, it's like looking to the heat death of the universe. But we do a 2-year plan. We do a strategic plan that covers the next 2 years. We also do financial planning. We've actually done financial planning out much longer. We've modeled, and in fact the last fee schedule change, which set fees based on your V4 or V6 holdings, based on your the category that fits you, actually accommodates that full transition period out back to IPv4 address return. So the good news is this community doesn't really have to worry much about that, but do think about what you want the policy book to look like. What should the NRPM look like 5 years or 10 years from now? Because it's quite possible if you just incrementally change it to get there, you'll end up with a book several times larger than it needs to be.
Jason?
Jason Schiller, Google, ASOAC. I actually want to answer part of Craig's question. And I think when there is no longer a waiting list for unmet IPv4 resources, and when there's no longer IPv4 addresses bought and sold on the transfer market, then we can probably dispense with a lot of the IPv4 policy. I imagine at that time, ARIN would have stores of IPv4 addresses, more than there's demand for. And I think the thing that would be important at that time frame would be aggregation. How can we encourage people to give back what they've got, to get a single block, and to reduce the number of slots in the routing table? Until that time, I think we probably need to maintain much of the IPv4 policy. I think that some of it is complex and we can simplify it. I think that maybe we can reorganize it to make it more easier to read, more easier for people to skip the sections that don't apply to them. And I think in a lot of ways we probably can bring some of the needs measurements of end users and ISPs in line with each other, just as we've done with the fee structure. But generally, I think, you know, we still need the policy and the corner cases that we're trying to protect, like critical infrastructure. That's still important, and it will remain important until IPv4 is irrelevant. And we'll know when it's irrelevant when there's no longer a waiting list and there's no longer transfers. But I think that's not in the near future.
Thanks. Alon?
Alain John speaking, just on my own behalf, certainly not on any of my employers, present, past, or future. I've been here for a long time, and if I simply observe what's the purpose of the community, for the longest time it was to allocate addresses. And when the free pool ran out, somehow need to reconsider what is the larger purpose here. That's why I really applaud your effort to look at this, step back, and says, what are we here for collectively? And when it is not about allocating addresses, what is it? It's about, well, as the speaker was talking about, maybe aggregation, maybe making sure that the data that is there reflect the actual use of the database, and thinking about who are the customers of the database. Not simply does it reflect it according to how it's built, but for the people who are really using it. And keeping this in mind while actually looking at those different policies. Do they help or not?
Kevin?
Kevin Bloomberg. So, Vint, you brought up a very important question or made an important statement, and I'll remind everybody of the omnibus joke, which is you never want to get thrown under the omnibus, and making radical changes to the NRPM historically with the community hasn't worked. That being said, when you look at the number of proposals that are now in the transfer, that are now being done via transfer market, that can be compacted down through a series of simplified policies individually, just to look at them, yes, agree, move on, yes, agree, move on. I personally believe the community is more adept at dealing with small bite-size policies in that regard. In regards to what Jason said with the waiting list, I think that's actually the gate in this whole discussion. We have to deal with the waiting list and this perpetual waiting list that is nobody's ever going to get off of, because we're getting dribs and drabs back, almost nothing back over the next 5 years. So we're going to keep an entire Encyclopedia Britannica of policy for a /18 or 16 worth of space over the next 5 years. I feel bad for anybody who reads the NRPM and is expecting that there will be space on the waiting list, that they will be able to get on the waiting list. So I actually consider the waiting list to be a detriment right now to policy, but I believe that we do have to address that to be able to really clean up the policy manual.
Kathy?
Hi, Kathy Aronson. Kevin said a bit of what I was going to say. This is my 18th year on the advisory council, and the last big policy proposal we passed was the transfer policy, which took endless amounts of time. Anyway, I'm not really sure how in the bottom-up process, how we rearrange this and get it past get consensus. I mean, if people have ideas how we can accomplish that, it would be awesome, because this needs to happen desperately, but I'm not really sure in my experience like how we make it possible. I'm just
So-
at a loss.
so
I mean, I
one
think this is awesome that you're getting us all thinking about it and talking about it, and but
Well, you and Kevin touch on that interesting point in that, the question kind of goes to this room and beyond is, do we want to continue taking these nibble type bites at this problem, or is the community ready for a big bus proposal?
well, I mean, the reason we have 5 levels of stuff is because of the bits and bytes of little pieces of things that get tweaked and then added, and anyway. Yeah. So anybody who has ideas for the AC on how we might accomplish this, that would be awesome.
We'll happily shepherd an omnibus. Go ahead. Front mic.
Hi, Chris Woodfield, Twitter. Sometimes it's useful to think of policy like this. Look at it with think of it as an analog to as one would look at, say, computer code. On all of these, a code is written, inevitably bugs will pop up, and a lot of these, additions and adjustments are in effect bug fixes. So when looking at it through that perspective, a rewrite has very much a danger of losing the perspective and regressing and reintroducing a lot of those bugs. One thing that might be useful is looking at some of the corner cases and finding out, okay, at the time this was introduced, this was a problem. Are we now going to hit that bug again if we remove that bug fix? And in many cases, the answer may be no, and that section can be cleaned up. Something I randomly thought of is maybe a way of taking some of the more obscure clauses and marking them historic so that they can be referenced in certain cases where the more general cases don't apply to a request, but not part of the main policy, possibly.
Okay.
Folks, if you're going to be speaking, please approach the mics. I am going to be closing the queue shortly.
Thank you. So my name's Chris Tassett, Tassett Law, ARIN AC. However, the radical comments I'm about to make are purely my own. And it's more really questions than any kind of firm suggestion. But I'd like to put it in this way. In my day job, I do a lot of governance-related work, and I think what this exercise and this need is showing is that we have a governance challenge. And what I mean by that is that the systems that we've traditionally used, the PDP as it's defined today, isn't particularly well suited for a radical overhaul such as this. Now, I don't know what the solution is, but one possibility would be to suggest some other temporary way of dealing with one omnibus change for this one particular need where you have to make such a global change. And in other organizations, if you need to radically change the processes and procedures by which something is done, typically the board would ask staff to come up with various options. Those would be considered, and then staff would be asked to help in actually developing those options. The reality is that no one member of the community is well equipped to do all of that. And if somebody came in with such a proposal, I'd be suspicious that it would be slanted perhaps with one organization's perspective, and that wouldn't be helpful to the community either. So this is a big enough exercise. It seems to me we might want to think about it in a special way on a one-time basis and develop a different governance framework. It may be that we need a large subset or maybe the whole AC to actually take hold of this and as a group work the problem. It may be that we need staff's involvement to help with ideas for how the streamlining might happen. It might be the case that we might need their help with some of the initial drafting and then bring it back to the community for feedback. And in so doing, we might want to adopt perhaps the approach that's been taken where we have some sort of fast track authorization so we can't tinker with it too much and end up disassembling it all at the end through too many cuts and bruises. I know it's radical, I know it's a big departure, but in answer to the question that Kathy posed, it's a governance problem, and if we don't change the way that we apply our governance for such a massive exercise, I don't think we're going to be able to do it. And I've been thinking about this problem for 2 years ever since I joined the AC. Those of you who recall when I ran for the AC will recall that I was very concerned and wanted to promote NERPM simplification. And honestly, I've been banging my head against the wall of how to do that as an individual in the community. And so we need to think about this differently. I don't know what that is, but that's my thought. Thanks.
Thanks. I think it was Andrew.
Andrew Dahl, ARIN AC. I actually want to disagree with Chris Tassett on this. I don't think we have a governance problem in terms of the PDP itself. I think we can do an omnibus through our existing PDP or a large-scale policy change if we don't want to. What I think it needs for this to happen is we have, as a community, need to put down our little knives or hatchets or whittles or whatever when we have one of these and realize we're not going to get everything we want when we take something from this and shrink it down to this, and from something large and shrink it down to something small in terms of text. And so in doing that, we have to realize that the community has a responsibility to say, I'm not going to get all of the corner cases in something that's smaller. That's just a fact. And the AC has to say, we are willing to accept some level of people objecting to individual parts of this in order to reach a larger goal of simplification that makes it much easier for the community as a whole. And I think this can be done for Section 4. I don't think this can be done for Section 6 for the IPv6 policy. But I think it can be done for Section 4. A number of us have done rewrites for Section 4. We haven't published them publicly because we haven't felt there was the right time to do so. But if the community as itself is willing to embrace that we are now in a different world, we are in a post-exhaustion world for our region, and that takes a different mindset, and that the corner cases that we used to have no longer matter in the same way that they did in previously.
Rear mic? Jason? I see.
Okay. Jason Schiller, Google, ASOAC. I think the approach to this that's going to work is for the AC to go through and clean up the text. Do editorial changes, use consistent language, use consistent headings and how things are parsed out. Go through and do a complete rewrite without changing any policy. I think that's the first step. Try and clarify the language and shorten it as much as possible, but still keeping it clear and still keeping the policy intact. I think the second step then is reorganizing the text to make it more easily parsable. Possibly moving stuff not to a historic document, but maybe to the end of the document. Let's deal with the corner cases, but let's deal with them further on in the document so that most people don't have to read through it and be subjected to it if they don't need to use it. And then I think the third step is to look at those corner cases and suggest we remove one of them and see if there is an injured party. And if there's an injured party that says, no, we need that, then don't remove it. Then try and combine it with something else. Well, can we take this corner case and give it the same rules as something else that exists? And maybe that gives the corner case a little extra space or a little extra wiggle room or a little extra leeway. And if the community is acceptable and amenable to that in order to get a smaller policy proposal, then probably no one is injured. That's, I think, the steps I would take if I was on the AC to try and push forward a big dramatic change like this.
So it's Vince Cerf again, Google. I might take a different tactic, Jason. What strikes me as evident in this relatively thick document is that our model of the system that we're trying to manage has gotten more complex because it has gotten more complex, and we're trying to deal with cases and scenarios that didn't necessarily exist in the earlier days of deployment of the internet. It might be an alternative, if I were trying to do this, would be to start out to try to build a model of the creatures in the zoo that needed to be accounted for in the policies, and see whether I could understand and describe what their behavior is in this ecosystem. And only with that model in hand, then try to infer from that what kind of rules make sense. Now, none of these, anything that's been suggested so far, including this suggestion, sounds very easy at all. But having models in hand can help a lot, I think, in formulating the problem. So trying to deal with the existing text is coping with a complex object which is accreted over time, kind of like barnacles on a ship that slow the ship down. that it may be that trying to do what Jason is suggesting might not end up with as conceptually clean a result as trying to make sure that our model of this ecosystem as it currently exists is more clear with that exercise than it is today, interpreting and inferring it from the complex rules that we've written.
Owen?
Learned a lot about my ARIN. There's 3 sections of the NRPM that account for the vast majority of the text: 4, 6, and 10. I think the remaining sections are, by and large, as succinct as they can be. Section 10 is dictated by global policy. It's policies that we have passed and that have been ratified subsequently by the Diana Board, and therefore, absent a global policy process, they're somewhat immutable. So I don't think we can really look towards simplifying Section 10 all that much. Reviewing Section 6, it has become somewhat complex, but I don't think overly so. There are a few things we could do, like deleting the HD ratio table that no longer matters to any policy whatsoever, and some other cleanup items that we can do that would shorten it. But I don't think there's a lot of simplification to be gained there, because we've actually made the policies relatively simple. We've made them relatively generous as well. Yes, there's lots of things we might be able to do in Section 4. However, the process of cleaning up Section 4 is probably going to take 3 to 5 years to get through the whole process. It's going to be relatively painful, it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of effort, and I would much rather see the people that would be involved in that effort, involved in the effort to make V4 irrelevant instead. Thank you.
I am closing the queues unless there's any final remarks. Okay, anything you'd like to say, Dan?
No, the advisory council will be happy to work on continue to work on this topic and welcome all feedback to the mailing list.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dan.